Okay, I think we will get started. Certainly people can continue to trickle in. I want to welcome everybody to this afternoon's informal conversation about the COP26 meeting. Monmouth University is particularly fortunate to have had two of its members present at that meeting, and I thought it would be a really exciting opportunity for them to share what they saw with our campus and give us some of their reflections and offer some guidance as to where we may go and how the community can become engaged. The two representatives are Tony MacDonald, who is the director of the Urban Coast Institute here at Monmouth University, and Dr. Randall Abate, who is the Rechnitz Family Urban Coast Institute endowed chair in marine and environmental law, and he's a member of the Department of Political Science and Sociology. I'm not going to do any more of their background. They can intersperse some of their history that might be relevant as we continue. I would rather spend time hearing of their impressions of the conference, and then we'll open up for questions in the last 10, 12 minutes of our hour's time together. So I want to start off first with how each of you got to the conference. And by that, I mean, were you invited? I know there were 20,000 people. How did you end up being one of those 20,000? And I'll start with Tony.
So this was a bit of a process. I had actually attended the Paris Convention 5 years ago during those negotiations, but at that point I sort of attended as something called civil society. So at that point I was invited by a group of colleagues who were interested in the role of oceans play in climate, and they were having a special day focusing on oceans and climate. So I've been interested and been following the proceedings for quite a while. But I realized this year at Monmouth that we have an emerging interest on campus and also expertise with Professor Abate joining the faculty in climate issues. So last fall, I put in an application on behalf of the Institute and the university to become an official observer to the convention. And that means you get sort of a higher level credential to actually participate in more of the negotiations and discussions. So to my pleasant surprise, again, we reflected some efforts in growing interests, the work we do on the climate teach-in every year with Catherine Duckett and the other professors, the work that Randy will probably expand on a little bit in terms of his international work. We are accepted as an observer, and at that point we were invited to join and come to the conference, and there were a certain number of places. They reduced the number of folks people could send this year because of the COVID protocols, but we were offered 2 spaces to participate in the meeting. So after working through some of the mechanics, Randy and I were a little bit skeptical as things were going through the COVID protocols, but when we kind of got reassured that the meeting was being organized well, we made plans and we were fortunate enough to go. So it was really a great experience.
And as you raised the COVID issue, I had certainly I think I'm sure I'll speak for all of us that we had hoped by this time we wouldn't have to be talking anymore about COVID. But Randy, if you can maybe address what it was like to participate in a very large conference with an overseas travel in light of the pandemic, and if you had concerns, and were those concerns warranted?
It was remarkably challenging. I'm sure that comes as no surprise. Certainly wasn't as concerned as I expected to be about risk of exposure. I thought the protocols were managed well. Everyone was required to self-test daily before and produce their negative test results to enter the venue on their phones. And of course, testing flying in and flying out. So we were tested to death, but it was all for a good purpose. And I think more specific to the actual experience at the event, the COVID protocols just delayed things and restricted access in a way that was frustrating. So on a couple of levels, the ability for developing countries to participate was quite compromised due to COVID generally. Their ability to travel, because their countries were more impacted by COVID, to be able to attend in Glasgow was compromised. And then there were some issues with the remote access opportunities to participate that were plaguing the event for the first couple of days. So that further restricted access. But on a more personal note, the frustrations I had with the limited access was because of the COVID restrictions, the number of people in the rooms was severely restricted, and I had at least 3 or 4 sessions that I really wanted to attend, and the door was shut, and I was on a wait list that I was not able to get in off of the wait list when that capacity had been reached very early on. And I was just literally running from event to event trying to avoid that, and it was unavoidable. It was an unfortunate reality.
So let's follow up and talk about maybe 2 or 3 of the sessions that you did get to go into the room. And if you can tell us what those sessions were about, why you chose to attend those, and what you learned from those sessions.
Randy, why don't you start off a little bit?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I thought I had directed that to Randy.
Okay, sure, thank you. So it was very different for me on a lot of levels. This was my first COP, which is ironic because I've been a climate change scholar for 2 decades. I have been attempting to get to COPs in the past, and I'm grateful to Tony for the efforts that he made, because I was able to attend this pretty much attaching myself to the coattails of the process that he had initiated to get us approved as an observer. So it was a new experience for me about what to expect and what sort of content was going to be covered. And what I did appreciate was that it was a mix of opportunities to engage at a high level in a larger setting, and at a more intimate level with more opportunities for networking. And so I participated in both types of sessions, and they were equally valuable. Certainly the most memorable large session I attended was Al Gore's plenary speech, and that was remarkably well done, and really offered some hope about how the realities are that we have the private sector capacity to make this very ambitious and abrupt transition away from fossil fuels to clean and renewable energy, and how daunting that seems to many. But he had great data on how we have that capacity, and it really is a challenge of political will more than it is the science and technology and the business wherewithal to make it happen. And then some smaller sessions I was able to attend based on my areas of expertise, youth and indigenous climate activism, and those were very valuable, and more of a one-on-one interaction before and after sessions, and really was very impressed with what was delivered in those sessions as well.
Terrific. I do want to get to the networking, but Tony, I want to give you an opportunity to also speak to a couple of sessions that were highlights for you.
So, I would think of thinking of the sessions and networking and almost kind of an overlapping issue. You have to sort of to visualize this. It really is like a big convention for climate nerds, with not only the major plenary events that Randy mentioned, but also a lot of small sessions, which might be around negotiating about a particular issue relating to it, or discussing a scientific input into those reports. But most of the nations and most of the interest groups and civil society groups also had what almost like, a convention center where they would actually be holding a whole series of different briefings about commitments that were being made or issues that they were engaging. So I did spend a lot of my time at the US Center, and some of the panels that they were having, which not only were interesting about their commitments. So I attended a great panel with 6 US senators discussing what the congressional commitments were and what their excitement was about being re-engaged in the climate discussions, and had personal conversations with Senator Markey from Massachusetts and Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, with some colleagues that knew them. There was an excellent session on the commitment that the U.S. made to protecting 30% of ocean waters and land waters by 2030, and that was coordinated by Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and Environment, Monica Medina. So I not only got a chance to see that session, but talk with her. And one of the panelists was Dr. Rick Spinrad, who is the administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So substantively, it was of interest to me as an ocean guy, but also from a networking perspective, it was really interesting to meet some of these people, or to re-meet them and discuss some of the commitments that were being made. And then just to kind of capture the kind of sense of it, as I was walking around there was a session with John Kerry and Bill Gates talking at the Indonesia Pavilion of all things, talking about the commitments of finance and the new commitments that were made by beyond governmental commitments to international finance. And so again, you couldn't keep up to some extent, and I do think that Randy and I were a bit drinking from a fire hose as we kind of were doing a little bit of a scouting expedition to figure out how Monmouth and UCI wants to continue to be actively involved in these issues moving forward.
So let's give Randy a chance to equally name drop as Tony got to do there. Some people that you were able to meet and talk with that were particularly notable for you?
I have a very different experience. First of all, it's impossible to keep up with Tony and his networking and name dropping in a good way. But it was, I think, a space that is more Tony's turf, having the distinguished background in as a lobbyist as he does. It was a landscape that was very different for me, having attended primarily academic conferences in my career. I found it more difficult to network because I was just a bit overwhelmed by the environment, with so many people and running around from event to event and huddling here and giving a high five to someone as you run past them in the hallway. It wasn't an environment I was used to for networking. And to give you an example, I went to a side event at the University of Strathclyde that was on climate litigation, taking advantage of so many academics having converged in Glasgow that week. And I had more of a positive networking experience in the 4 hours I was at that event than I did all week in the Blue Zone, because it was something I was just trying to take in and understand how to navigate for the 4 days I was there. I did get to spend some time in the Green Zone as well, which is the civil society space. And I found that was also difficult for networking, but for different reasons. It was a bit of a ghost town at the time that I went there, which was surprising. I think overall, it's the kind of thing that requires a lot more preparation in advance for how you want to maximize the ability to network, reach out to folks who you know are going to be there and try to set up opportunities to talk, because I found it wasn't the sort of opportunity that you just show up and people congregate around you and you rub shoulders with people that you want to connect with. It's a big event with a lot of barriers to break through for that to be productive.
But let me just kind of play on that a little bit, because again, as I said, this was a bit of a scouting expedition for us, and there were some conversations that Randy and I had both individually and as a group that really have led to pretty active follow-up since then. So we met with some colleagues from what was called the Global Ocean Forum, which including international representatives that are thinking about continuing to push oceans within the climate agenda. And they have asked us for our insights and potential participation in their strategic planning process moving forward. So we've set up a call with those colleagues in the coming weeks to discuss what their plans are and what their priorities might be. Similarly, I met with a colleague from the Ocean Conservancy who focuses on international issues. I work a lot with environmental groups who are targeting US policies, and this is a group that's actually focused predominantly on international issues. So I've had already one coordinating call with some of the international environmental groups and other academic institutions interested in continuing to put oceans and climate, and we have a conference call with some of them. So we're trying to figure out how to be engaged with them. And Randy sort of identified some other opportunities to continue to work sort of with this academic network. One of the ways you really can influence these outcomes is to put in issue papers and to work with coalitions of groups to put in recommendations moving forward. So I think we're going to be a lot better prepared, and we'll probably be teaming up with some of these kind of coalitions of groups for the next conference, I hope, and for some of the side meetings that will happen between now and then.
Excellent. I'd like to move now to talking about outcomes of the meeting. And let's first talk about outcomes on a scale larger than Monmouth University, and then we'll turn to how we as a community can become engaged. So, Randy, if you can start off, but with what you think some of the successes were for short term, let's say things that we might see over the next 3 to 5 years as an outcome of COP26.
Well, I'll try to say this with as a limited amount of cynicism as I can. I would characterize the positive outcomes as seizing the low-hanging fruit. So they're far better than not moving forward on these issues, but they are, in the grand scheme, I think, baby steps and are things that were already kind of in the works, but they just kind of became confirmed through the COP26 process. So a few examples would be the agreement of more than 100 countries to reduce methane by 30% by 2030. And another example would be countries that represent about 90% of the world's forests agreeing to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. And then there's also the partnership, the declaration between the US and China, which is certainly a very positive step forward, but very open-ended aspirational language about how US and China are proposing to work together to address greenhouse gas emission reductions in their respective countries. So those are certainly positive steps forward when we think back just to where we were in the Trump administration and how just having the US re-engaged in this process at any level is very positive, not to mention having some pretty significant engagement, not just from the US, but globally on very important things that need to happen moving forward at the international level to address climate change. And the other is the climate financing reality of the 100 billion per year that was supposed to be flowing from the developed countries to the developing countries. This was established in 2009 in Copenhagen. It was never fully achieved, but at this COP26, there was a commitment to meet and exceed that 100 billion, and without really any choice, because that number is now far too low, and it really needs to be almost doubled to address the mitigation and adaptation needs in the developing world.
So I'm a little less cynical than Randy, even though I agree with everything that he said, and that's because I do think that there were some what I consider to be sort of changes in general attitude across things. You have to understand, to reach an agreement, every country has to agree. So this, you have to understand why some of this language gets watered down, and it's unfortunate perhaps from a perspective of really the degree of the challenge here. But if when you recognize that how many countries have to sign this agreement in order for it to be considered an agreement, it really is a very difficult task. So I do think the ambitions were high and they weren't fulfilled. But I would actually, on a sort of a more optimistic spin to what Randy said, I think the engagement of the private sector in finance was much greater. And so I do think it is recognized now that it's not only a governmental problem, but also a full society problem. So the discussion, there was never an explicit discussion of starting to phase out coal or trying to get to decarbonize the economy. So I think in that regard, that was a significant change of focus. Still a lot to do, still a lot of promises, still some loopholes, but I do think, at least by external accounts, they did think with some of these side agreements, methane and others that Randy mentioned, that they had gotten almost to the 1.5 degree number. I think they're now talking 1.8. And the other thing, which is again, seems a little bit procedural, but they agreed to come back next year and discuss their recommitments. So all of the countries agreed to go back and look at what they call their national determined contributions, what their plans are. So really coming back that quickly, I think, holds their feet to the fire a good bit. And I want to give Randy a shout out for actually his engagement with the youth activists and some of the civil society groups. So really that has really changed the level of energy, I think, in the room, and the need to really think about generationally and really what the nature of the challenge and impacts might be. So I do think the US also came across with several very specific commitments that have significance, I think, for the things that we'll think about here in the US as well, including zero emissions, decarbonizing the shipping industry, committing to this 30 by 30 goal for marine protected areas, really looking at also moving the electrification of vehicles as a primary objective. And so I do think there's some real commitments, including the US agreeing to something which is the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economies, which is an international effort to really looking at how we plan for sustainable ocean economies in the future. So I think there were some actions that will have not only international consequence, but also, I think, set us on a goal here in the US to be a little bit more ambitious. And as Randy said, is living up to those goals. The financing isn't even near what it needs to be to address the issues. Everybody recognizes that. But 5 years ago, there was almost no discussion of adaptation and investing in adaptation and coastal resilience. And it was a primary focus of a lot of the discussions in Glasgow.
Thank you. Both of you kind of mentioned the U.S. presence, and I'm curious as to how you felt, I mean, obviously as Americans present at a conference where U.S. commitment has not been uniform over the past 5 years, let's say. And did you feel any pressure or pushback as an American at this conference?
Well, I felt relieved not to have to wear a bag over my head for the first time in several years. So that was a step forward. But I still think one thing to take away from the U.S. and its engagement on climate change for the past 3 decades is that regardless of whether we've had a Republican or a Democratic administration, it's been well below where it needs to be. I mean, the U.S. needs to be the leader that it was on international environmental issues in the 80s. We look at our engagement at the Stratospheric Ozone Depletion Convention and others at that time. We were a leader, and then we became part of the problem for the next almost 3 decades. So I think the positivity, everybody is looking to the U.S. to be more of a leader, and I think there was a positive vibe about the U.S. engagement this time around. And I think we're not just talking, we're also walking the walk. So just in the first year of the Biden administration, that evidence of our commitment is still not near where it should be, but just the rollout of electric vehicles and offshore wind engagement is a huge way of demonstrating our good intentions. And the reality is that as many good intentions as the Biden administration may have, very little of it will happen without Congress, and Congress is still in a bit of a dysfunctional period. And even with the recent infrastructure bill and the climate-related provisions it has, those in the grand scheme are just baby steps. We are still one of the few developed countries in the world without a climate change regulatory framework, which was still a bit embarrassing.
So I guess I would just add to that in a couple of ways. One is that I do think, and again, in addition to my kind of policy focus and legal focus, I also am a member of the U.S. National Committee for the UN Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And so I do think there is an interest in ocean U.S. leadership, and that's a bipartisan issue on Congress for ocean science and investment in research and being a leader in informing not only climate action, but sustainability action for ocean environments as well as ocean economic activity. So that's really sustainable. So I do think I went to several sessions about offshore wind, which is an issue that is of interest internationally. There were at least 3 recognized initiatives that would contribute to mitigating greenhouse gases around offshore wind commitments internationally, electric vehicles internationally, and also decarbonization of the shipping industry, as well as the third one, which I think is really important, which is blue carbon and environmental protection, as being sure that both from a forest and ocean perspective, we can continue to sustain the environment that actually regulates the carbon. So these are all positive things that I do think, despite what Randy said, quite admittedly difficult challenges in Congress, which doesn't seem to be able to get on the same page on anything. But I do think those are issues that can develop some consensus and hopefully have continuity regardless of the administration.
Terrific. So the 3 of us are of a more experienced generation, I'll put it like that. Can you speak to what the participation was of younger generations, let's say college age students? Were they present? Did they have a voice? And how were they met?
Let Randy start with that one, because I anticipate what his answer is going to be.
Well, there are structural avenues for youth engagement in the COP process. So there are organizations that give them a voice that's that's better than nothing, but certainly not at the level that it ought to be. And so there's a lot of dialogue now about legal representation of the rights of future generations, so that we wouldn't even need to have youth present to make sure that their interests are being taken into account whenever we're talking about regulation of climate change and those matters that have such an impact on the future that they're going to inherit. So I think their interest in being involved is higher than it's ever been. I think it's still relegated largely to the protests in the streets, and that is certainly valuable. And they're right to be cynical about how much can be achieved at COP, and Greta Thunberg's rhetoric of blah 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 certainly has a lot of truth to it. That we certainly can't wait for these annual meetings to get things right. What really needs to happen is what is brought home and translated at the federal, state, and local levels into meaningful and immediate actions to implement a lot of the rhetoric. So I think the youth engagement, where we're seeing more of it, is in litigation, and so that's happening largely at the federal levels in a country by country basis. Some regional efforts now underway, but that's where the youth are having the most effective impact, is seeking to hold governments accountable for what they pledge to do, and bringing legal action when they don't act to meet that goal or don't act at all.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Randy 100%. I would, however, also say that I think it's something, maybe I'm not going to anticipate your next question, but I do feel like one of my takeaways was that essentially the solutions, tomorrow's solutions, are not going to look like what we think the solutions are like today. So really, and not only engaging youth from the perspective of what they bring in terms of what is at stake for them, but also thinking about training them and engaging them in a way that they will be able to be part of the solution 10 years from now. So if we think about the ocean decade science, in 10 years science is going to look different. If we think about some of the technology that's going to be developed between now and then, I think that's different. So I do think we also need to engage and think about student participation and youth participation from a perspective of what kind of skills they're going to need to live and influence the world 5 and 10 years from now.
So let's transition now to what you're bringing back to Monmouth, and how our community, our faculty and staff and students and our local residents can learn from this. So let's start off with how this conference is going to affect what each of you are doing as part of your employment at Monmouth, and then we'll talk about how students can get involved. So Randy, you want to go first?
Well, for me, that's already happened. So Tony and I started that even before we left. So we had a what to anticipate from COP panel at the climate crisis teach-in that Dr. Duckett did a fantastic job organizing for the 3rd year in a row now. And also I participated with other colleagues on a youth activism panel, very much considering what's at stake in COP. So immediately upon my return, I've given guest lectures, and as of next week in 3 different classes. Dr. Duckett's Science and Politics of Climate Change being one of those, climate science class, Professor Kava's class on that, and Dr. Medley's global sustainability class next week. So my goal is to spread this message across campus as much as possible, but in small batches. I think having those more intimate conversations and engaging students in a way that doesn't overwhelm them is really the most effective way to get the word out. And I've always incorporated into the courses I'm teaching. But having come back from COP, there's been, I think, a higher level of interest across the student body. And I think the Outlook is doing a fantastic job of covering climate-related issues, in part because of the awareness that the climate crisis teach-in has raised on campus. So I think there's just a lot of ways to keep the dialogue moving rather than just big conference events in many smaller batch kind of ways.
And Tony?
So as I indicated, I'm already ongoingly involved through this UN Decade effort I'm involved with in the National Academy of Science Social Studies Board. So I'll continue to do that, but I see a lot of opportunities. Brandy and I are going to scope out the upcoming relevant meetings that might be happening, not only COP27, which is a year from now in Egypt, but also there are a lot of side meetings, including one of the outcomes from this conference was a commitment to an annual ocean climate dialogue that's going to be coordinated across all of the different elements of the UN. So that includes biodiversity and pollution and other issues. So there is a UN UN Oceans Conference in Portugal in June that we might have an opportunity to be active in. So we are going to look at how we can maybe bring students and engage them, not only in helping us understand and plan for those, but participate in those. I have started a faculty advisory council here for the Urban Coast Institute. And one of the things that we are looking at, we're setting up our objectives for next year, is how we work to expand the work that's already being done through the climate teach-in and the individual courses, to be thinking about how we engage oceans and climate impacts across the curriculum at Monmouth. So again, beginning those discussions, but we need to work across the schools to figure out what makes sense for them, building on some of the opportunities that Randy outlined. Some of the initiatives will have direct impact on our regional ocean planning work that we're already involved in, and Carl Bill manages the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal project. So we'll actually be looking, and I've already talked with colleagues at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in DC about what the implications might be for regional ocean planning. And obviously with New Jersey's commitment to offshore wind and some of these other activities, how the US engages and supports that at the regional level will probably influence how we work on those issues at the Urban Coast Institute and work with some of the students. So I just see a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of relevance to discussions that are ongoing at Monmouth. And I want to raise one of them, which is the interest in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. I do think Randy, from a litigation perspective and representing kind of the voiceless, I think that will continue, but I also will like to engage the community at Monmouth a little bit more to be thinking about access and the impacts of climate on some of the coastal communities in New Jersey. And Tom Harrington, who works on some of the resilience issues, is specifically scoping out some projects that we might work on to really think about the disproportionate impacts of sea level rise and storms on some of the underrepresented communities in the region. So again, I think opportunities and more work to do, so stay tuned.
So what would you say to our students who are obviously concerned about where the world is heading? How can they get involved? What can they learn from COP26? What steps can they take? How can they engage with the two of you? Open that up in all those dimensions.
Well, I think in a lot of concrete ways, working with UCI on the opportunities that it offers in this space is really valuable. So UCI has provided generous funding for student research efforts that I've had the pleasure of supervising over the past few years on different aspects of the climate space and marine dimensions of that. And that's really been opening up opportunities for students who are very interested in pursuing this seriously, perhaps at a career level, and getting that opportunity in undergrad really puts them at a huge advantage. I think more informally, for those that might not be necessarily seeking a career in this space, there's just more around campus in terms of coursework and student organization opportunities that are very much getting more engaged in climate issues related to what's happened at COP26. So I think there's plenty of opportunities very much on a local campus level and in our communities as well. I think there are all kinds of opportunities to engage at the state and local levels on anything that relates to climate change impacts. Some of it is related to the marine and coastal space, and others may be involved with transportation issues or energy issues. And so there's just, it can feel overwhelming. And I think it's also important for students to understand that there is a recognition now of what's known as climate anxiety. And we have an expert on our faculty who talks about eco-wellness, Dr. Delaney. And I think that's a very important thing for our students and their generation to be aware of, that that's an important thing to talk about and explore a bit, and ultimately overcome it by being aware of it to the extent that they can. It's something that all of us need to be aware of, about how a compromised future affects the way you engage on a day-to-day basis, and how to make the most of that reality.
So I would just add that to say, actually, I have a kind of core message, which is this is not a science issue. This is really an issue that's impact everybody. So there really is a role for everybody at Monmouth who is interested in it, whether it's their career or not. So I do think very much, I mean, there was a large presence of the arts community at COP, and really thinking about how to engage that. And we work with some professors here at Monmouth around that space. One of the things I was so excited about, I've kind of been going around and meeting with the deans in the various schools and the faculty that I know, in addition to starting up this faculty advisory council. And I was surprised to find out how much is starting to develop organically around this issue. So the business school has a task force in strategic planning issues, looking at how do they consider societal impact in their teaching of their students, but also thinking about career paths around things like climate risk and impact of storms, or think about sustainable finance. So that was really interesting to me. The education school, meeting with Dean Henning was there's a lot of interest within the education. They had a kind of a academy last year on sustainability for teachers and students, and they're going to have another one this March. So I am really just finding everywhere across the university, building on some of the stories that we heard during the climate teach-in of a lot of interest. And so I think there actually is a lane for almost anybody at Monmouth, whether they're studying arts, social sciences, humanities. There's a lot of interest in developing classes around climate communications. There's a lot of interest in developing environmental humanities. We have some really wonderful classes that you can take within the English department about how do you read and understand it. So again, I think there are more opportunities than people recognize. And so I'm very interested in working with others to kind of give that a little bit of a sense of community, so that everybody can feel a place at the table.
So I'd like to, before we move to the open session, I'd like for each of you to think about what were the big misses of COP26? What opportunities didn't we take advantage of? And this leads into my next question, which would be, how can somebody get involved in COP27? So what are the big items that we still need to address, and then how can people get at that next meeting?
I'll certainly let Tony speak to the getting to the next meeting part, but it's a longer list than what I'll share, but I'll focus on 2 points that were the biggest misses in my mind, which are first the loss and damage discussion. So this has been an ongoing tension between the developed and developing worlds, and once again, even with all the climate emergency awareness that we now have at our disposal, that really spells catastrophe for the developing world. The developed countries once again really balked at this notion of being accountable to pay developing countries for resources that are lost as a result of climate change, and that is something that is crippling the economies of the developing world. And ultimately, all that came out of COP26 was an agreement for further discussion on this issue, and you can imagine how outraged the developing countries were to hear that after years and years of discussion on this topic, and the urgency could not be higher. It relates to the point about how much money there really is in the developed world, and how much of what comes out of these COP meetings is doing just enough on a country by country basis to be able to go back to your constituents in your home country and say, look, we moved the ball forward. So for example, in the US, they pledged, the Biden administration pledged $5 billion for this climate fund. But it's important to put that in context, because the response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was 30 billion. So I think it's very important to understand that the developed world can and should do so much more than what it's doing, and a lot of it is just they're taking advantage of political and economic might to do less than they ought to, morally and politically. And so that was a big concern. The other is related to that, and that is the idea of fossil fuel phase out. So fossil fuel phase out did not happen at all. Any way to mute that person?
Was it Amsterdam?
Yeah, whoever is host, if you could mute Richard Kent.
Thank you. There you go. Bravo.
Okay, so thank you. So the second piece was there was so much more awareness, which was positive, about the need to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels. But the problem was that again was subject to compromise at a time of emergency, where language was initially in the draft agreement about phase out of coal, and China and India ultimately broke that deal and insisted on language that is merely phased down. And when you think about coal, I mean, coal is something we should have phased out of a long time ago. And we're still being plagued by overuse of oil and natural gas, which are very bad as well. But coal is a source of the past, and so this is really troubling for the global community, and it relates to this idea of the need for a just transition. I mean, it's not fair to blame China and India for having coal-based energy systems more so than other countries. It's important to recognize that it has to be a global and domestic effort to find ways to force this transition toward clean and renewable in a way that doesn't create social and cultural chaos. And that's really where I think the focus has to be moving forward.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that three quick things. One is that I do think the other side of the accomplishments is what is making sure that we live up to them. So I think accountability and transparency is a big issue. There were some agreements with regard to improving what they call stock taking and accountability of issues. So really tracking next year when they come back with the NDCs, and when they come back next year, I think there's a real opportunity to be much more explicit about what is needed. And then you can actually galvanize action at the national level as well as internationally. So again, these folks are very responsive to the outside groups like the youth groups, but also their own internal framework. So there will be an opportunity in a year from now to really measure this and see whether the stock taking and the measurements are actually accurate with regard to issues. Another sort of small step in the right direction in this thing was the agreement on kind of a market for carbon trading and really understanding carbon markets. So that's I think pretty important, and understanding how that will be implemented and trying to make that accountable, so that when we come back a year from now to the COP, that we are really understanding what it is we're measuring. I think that's pretty important. The third thing that I feel like is something I want to continue to advocate for, not only because I'm focused on oceans primarily, was I do think the role of nature and protection of the environment as a core fundamental objective and a foundational goal, that climate is something that impacts people and things, but really I think more investment in protection of the environment, so it continues to be a regulator of climate and continues to support life in the way that we are used to, whether it's biodiversity or the benefits we get from nature. I think we've made a lot of progress there, but I still think we're not there yet. And lastly, I do think we need to be honest about how much this is going to cost on adaptation. We just have to understand this is a transition. We can't, this is a process that's going to go out. We can't demonize the fuel industry. We need to work with them to make sure that this transfer is in a way that's going to be efficient and effective, so that both the developing world and the more prosperous societies can really share in the long-term benefits.
And Tony, can you address how somebody might be able to get involved in the next COP?
Again, in terms of how we're going to be involved, stay tuned a little bit. So we're trying to figure that out. So I would expect, as I discuss these things with Randy and some of the other schools, I'd like to, we've discussed developing a kind of a community around climate here. So I think we can identify those groups that are being advocates for various aspects. So everybody might have a particular issue that they're being involved with. And as I started in the beginning, this is a big process, and there's probably an interest group that we could help you identify, even if we're not doing it directly at Monmouth or through the Urban Coast Institute, that are active in various specific issues. So we'll maybe try to kind of have, I'm taking away an idea and assignment here. Maybe one thing we can think about, Randy, is developing just a little bit of a library for folks who are interested in being involved in ways that we might not be directly involved, but if they're interested in joining a group that is tracking these issues or any specific subset of those issues, we might develop those opportunities and try to provide that pathway for students or groups.
Terrific. So thank you both very much. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. If you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and jump in. I'm sure both Randy and Tony would be very happy to answer questions. Catherine?
Bill has never been on a call without asking a question, so I'm sure Bill will ask a question.
What groups in the civil society section of COP made the most effective interventions that, by your perception, moved the dialogue, even if it didn't result in an agreement? But what were effective people doing at COP?
So you have to understand that the groups are sort of, you'll have these observer groups as well as civil society who will then work with smaller coalitions of nations to advance various aspects of COP. So I do think that there was a pretty effective both national and observer group on the nature aspects, both on the forest and the oceans issue. So that is fundamentally changed from 5 years ago, and now they have a seat at the table. And that, from again, I was tracking that pretty closely. So that is a group of both nations, the small island developing states. I mean, people have seen maybe pictures of, you know, the Marshall Islands or others that are going to be underwater in 50 years. And so they have something very direct at stake. Those are very effective groups, and they have an effective message, the small island developing states. And they work with both environmental groups and academic groups to engage around that issue. I do think that there was also a effective group of nations looking at not loss and damage, as Randy said, but I do think adaptation. I do think the commitments, and some of these deals are what are called like side deals. So they're deals with international finance agencies. So there are like the insurance groups and are talking very specifically about how they as businesses manage risk and how they work with communities on that. So I do think some of those groups were pretty effective from what I could see in really focusing on adaptation and getting the finance community to begin to step up to the adaptation. The international commitments aren't what they need to be, but I do think the external groups were pretty effective in trying to get that on the agenda.
I would add that certainly Indigenous communities have had a longstanding impact and continued to do so at COP, raising that awareness of the emergency and the consequences on their vulnerable situation. And similarly, there's a growing partnership, if you will, between youth and Indigenous activism. It's something I'm writing about now in my scholarly works, and that's something that I'm very encouraged by. I think they're similarly vulnerable and similarly effective with their advocacy, and I think their efforts have really helped raise the ambition and just the awareness of the emergency we're facing and the consequences they will bear much more than the rest of us.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I am not seeing anything, so why don't we let both Tony and Randy have a couple of minutes to summarize anything that we haven't discussed, or you know, just your general impressions, whatever you'd like to close with, and we'll let Tony go first.
Yeah, hopefully it came across a little bit. I'm just very excited that Monmouth now has an opportunity to be thinking about how it might want to engage our community, and I define that broadly, our students and faculty, but also our partners, and work with others to influence this process, but also think about how we might influence the U.S. to be consistently at the table on these issues. So I have no doubt that oceans and climate is going to continue to be elevated as a significant issue. And again, not only in this treaty, so now I'm looking more closely at the Convention of Biodiversity and some of the land-based sources of marine pollution and the UN decades. So I actually do see this. The Climate Convention is only part of the solution. And so I've actually come away with some interesting ideas about how we can continue to be active in these issues. And again, I kind of am looking forward to working with more faculty who are interested in various aspects of this to see if we can broaden the team, so to speak, from Monmouth that is involved in these issues.
Randy?
I think one way of bringing all of this closer to home is just the importance of engagement in elections at the federal and state levels. It's just more important than ever. I think it's something we often take for granted, but when you think about why Congress isn't getting the things done that they ought to, it's because the wrong people are there. They're not representing the interests of the large majority of society. And I think part of that is because those whose interests need to be represented are not getting out and voting, or many of them are not old enough to vote. And so it's a way of just reminding all of us that are on this call that we have this responsibility, not only to ourselves, be sure to vote, but to spread the messaging that goes with why it's important to vote for certain candidates on and what the issues are, and not just make voting this game of identity politics. It's just remarkable to me how much ignorance has grown in the course of my lifetime about politics. I remember in high school having more informed debates about which candidate was better for a particular office than I see among adults of my age these days. It's just something that I think we've lost and that we need to regain in a context like climate change, that it's a defining issue. Regardless of how many hours per day you think about it, it is going to affect you dramatically. And it's something that the more I've been at Monmouth these 4 years, the more I see climate communication as the most important aspect of what we can do in a university community, not just to educate, but to engage in dialogue, to seize opportunities to bring climate change into the conversation. It's not an environmental issue. It's a social, cultural, political issue that affects all of our futures dramatically. And I think we're getting there, but we have to get there faster. And I think the whole language of the just transition is very important on a university campus as well. How this, as Tony mentioned, this is a fundamentally interdisciplinary challenge, and we have to reach across schools and departments to do a better job of seeing climate change as that quintessential interdisciplinary challenge for the future.
And it's not too early to be thinking about this. The next election is 11 months away, and now's the time to act. I couldn't agree with you more on that point, Randy. I want to thank both of you for your time today. I was jealous when I talked with Tony a few months ago that he was going to be going and be able to experience this, and this was maybe not quite being there, but gave us a real good sense of what the meeting was about, and a lot of really excellent take-home messages. So thank you both for your time. Thanks to everybody who participated today. I'm sure Tony and Randy would be happy to engage with any of you offline. And everybody have a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks again.
Thank you, Stephen.
Cheers.
Thank you, everybody.